Darren Beattie, conservative analyst, joins us now. Darren, thank you so much for joining us here on War and Pandemic. Belarus is a word that we're hearing a lot about recently, and when all of this started kicking off in Belarus, I don't think, and look, I'm not a Belarus expert. I'd like to understand, because for me it looked a lot like another one of these color revolutions that we've seen so many State Department and European Union apparatchiks supporting. There now appears to be some analysts out there at Revolver.news, for instance, putting these pieces together. Darren, we thought we'd bring you on the show to talk about it. Darren, tell us what is going on in Belarus. Is the current president legitimate? Is he an ally? Is he representative? And if all is to be believed, this guy isn't going to be around for long, is he?
Well, thank you for having me on. I would first like to anchor this discussion in your previous segment, which, by the way, the only thing more disgusting than the savagery of these Antifa paramilitary forces is the weakness and inability of any authorities, including federal authorities, to stop it. In my previous appearance on War Room, I pointed out that this joint Antifa Black Lives Matter paramilitary operation bore all of the hallmarks of these so-called color revolutions, namely precisely the types of activities and operations that are conducted through the State Department and its nexus of aligned NGOs in order to overthrow or undermine or question the legitimacy of a target government that they don't like. Here's where Belarus comes into play and is connected directly with Never Trump operations. This story that you mentioned in Revolver News, this sort of new Drudge Report, is about a guy called George Kent. Now, George Kent was one of the star Never Trump impeachment witnesses. He testified on behalf of his friends Yovanovitch, who was fired on the basis of her testimony, the lovely Lieutenant Colonel Vindman. That whole group, he's part of that group. He testified with them. Unlike them, he was not fired. In fact, he was promoted, which is a scandal in its own right. But you have this guy who's this Never Trump operator and testified in the impeachment against Trump. He's promoted within the State Department. But curiously enough, guess what he does at the State Department? He just happens to be the Deputy Assistant Secretary running Belarus, which just happens to have massive protests that look eerily similar to exactly the same operations that are being run right here in the United States to undermine Trump and terrorize his supporters or really anyone adjacent to them. And so the bigger picture really building up is that you have this, I don't want to say mafia, but certain network of Atlanticist organizations connected to the State Department and a bunch of aligned NGOs. And they have a very clear playbook of what they do when they don't like a particular leader in power. And that's called the Color Revolution Playbook. What I'm suggesting, and what this story suggests at Revolver News, is that these people view Trump in the same way that they view an antagonistic leader in Eastern Europe. These people basically all happen to be running Eastern European operations for the State Department or aligned organizations, and they're running the same playbook against Trump. And this particular figure, George Kent, literally embodies the nexus that I'm describing. The man who was a Never Trump impeachment witness who is now running Belarus, which is currently undergoing a color revolution that is suspiciously similar to what's happening in the United States. And in fact, there are other NGO-type groups that draw this parallel directly. Just briefly, there's one of these organizations called the Transatlantic Democracy Working Group, which is the who's who of these NGOs that I'm talking about, that has explicitly denoted what's happening in Belarus as, quote, the ghost of democracy's future. Belarus is a dry run for November.
Darren, the critics will say, but Lukashenko is an authoritarian dictator. The elections were not free. Election monitors have confirmed that. Protesters are on the streets, even at the president's own rallies. They're booing him, telling him to get off stage. And just over an hour ago, the stories broke on the wires that he says that he would rather die than hosting other elections in Belarus. But I guess what you're saying is, and correct me if I'm wrong, you're saying is, look, you got to park the concerns about who this person, how he runs this country is, because our concern is what Western partners, Western allies, Western funded apparatchiks, be they in the State Department, whether in the European Union, whether in Downing Street, what they're doing with their power. Am I getting that right?
You are. And I don't mean by what I'm saying to necessarily support or to not support Lukashenko. That's really not the purpose of this. And by the way, all the things that you described that they say about him, precisely the same things they do with Trump. So I just don't know. I do know that these Atlanticist groups don't like him. And my point is simply that they're running the same operation from the same playbook against Trump that they've used for decades now against leaders that they don't like in Eastern Europe. And that's a very important nexus to understand. It's not simply a similarity in tactics and strategy and playbook. It's literally the same people. As you saw in the impeachment hearings, Yovanovitch, Vindman, all of these people out of the State Department that have a revolving door through the NGOs, these are literally the same people who are color revolution experts. This is their craft. And in fact, the Revolver story that you mentioned at revolver.news actually mentions State Department sources who describe this George Kent figure as the color revolution expert. And one little interesting detail there, not only is he running Belarus now, but coincidentally enough, he was a deputy chief in Ukraine during arguably the most famous color revolution, the Orange Revolution, under the auspices of Victoria Nuland, who is a key player in color revolution operations and, of course, a key figure in the Never Trump movement as well.